Well, when David asked me to do this, I had a little bit of trepidation because the people that have preceded me on this stage were luminaries in all sorts of aspects of their field, and I'm sort of a generalist. But I feel like after all these years, this has become, in some ways, an extended family. Many of you have been here for all or most of the previous symposiums, and a lot of things have happened. There's been a lot of discoveries and research that's been spawned out of relationships that developed here. When I came up with this title, I wanted to challenge myself, and I think I really did, because it's kind of a daunting thing to say what life's going to be like in the cyber world out into the future. I've for a long time worked on my model for the technology side, and I'm using that as the basis. But I want to start with a little background and explanation. For many of you know this, but it'll bring to why I'm giving this talk today. As David mentioned, when Claudia and I first came up with this concept, it was as a result of Suzanne Turner's use of an Apple PC back in the middle 1980s. And over a period of time, she became pretty facile with it. It helped with her dexterity and her mental acuity. And it dawned on us that if we ever had a chance to give back, there's something to do with the applied technology of what was happening in computation. As time went on and we started to get the ability to start something in a modest way in the late 1990s, we started to realize that what was happening in wireless communications and in computing as the costs came down dramatically, and looking ahead at the capabilities that could be there, we made a leap of faith that in a short matter of a couple of decades, we really could have sort of what I think Clayton Lewis said at the time, turn the whole thing into a prothesis for life, something that can extend our awareness and can be an aid in our day-to-day life. And what we felt was, well, if that's true, then we should ride on that. That we should try to form a center of excellence that would bring together all the communities so that we could build not just the technologies, but the communities and the support structures and the applications that would personalize themselves to a person's abilities and disabilities and form that prothesis. And we were very lucky as we got started to have David join us because he opened our vision much more broadly across all the sciences. But what I want to do today is come back to that original vision and talk about where technology is going. So I'm just going to give you a short history of the information age, starting in 1960 and ending in 2040. Now, Peter Drucker is famous for saying that predicting the future is pointless, but it's possible to identify ongoing trends that would have significant effects. So I'm going to try to do this without getting into a lot of technical jargon, although that's a little bit difficult, and to give a view and paint a developing picture over time of capabilities that are going to be there, and then bring it back. So to tell you what I'm going to tell you, first I'm going to describe my model. I call it the cycles of information for the information technology revolution. And I'm going to use the last 48 years, since 1960, to demonstrate how this model actually exhibits Drucker's effects, the significant effects, the kinds of trends that are happening. Next, what I'll do is I'll talk about the point we're at right now, because I really do believe we are at a unique inflection point in history, a unique inflection point. Something that I think is as fundamental a leverage for mankind as the invention of language. Third, I'm going to build the next 32 years. And then finally, I'll just give you some of the characteristics of what it'll be like to live in the world of what I call web presence. But first, I have to get a drink. Pardon me if my voice gets a little raspy. I'm just recovering from a throat infection. Okay, cycle of innovation model. Another quote. History does not repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. Mark Twain. Okay, so this model is actually very simple. Don't let it be daunting. Most of us have heard about the waves of computing. You know, over the last several decades, every 10 years we invent something new in computing, and then that wave happens, and then we've met something new, and then that wave happens. Well, that's actually true. Now, this doesn't start at the beginning of computing, because we'd already invented the mainframe. We've invented the basic model. It starts when we started to invent the capabilities that could commoditize it, make it so cheap that everybody could have it. There's a famous conference that happened in the 50s. I think it was called the National Computer Conference. It went through the late 70s, where someone stood up once and gave a speech. Now, at that point, one of the famous computer scientists had predicted that these computers were so powerful that by the end of the century, we might need a couple dozen of them. And somebody stood up and gave this talk about how computers were going to be ubiquitous. Somebody stood up and said, "You got to be crazy. To be that ubiquitous, you'd have to have one in every lock and key you push your card into." Well, guess what? We did that before the end of the century. But what made this happen? How did we commoditize things? So let's talk about the cycles. It'll only take me 5 minutes to go through the last 48 years because it's very simple. The hard part is the next 32 years. So if a cycle starts every 10 years, what was the first cycle? Well, the first cycle was the invention of semiconductors. And then the second cycle was the invention of computers built on semiconductors. Remember, we're going to make them really, really cheap so everybody can have them. And the third cycle was the invention of commodity networks, so everybody could have a network. Instead of a network being a really, really expensive thing you can only put in big corporations, you now can spend $29.95 and buy this little card at your local electronics store and plug it into your telephone outlet, and now you have a network, or your SDL or your cable outlet. So those are cycles happen every 10 years. Those are the three cycles that built the computer industry and IT as we know it. But cycles actually are a little more complex than that. Because it's not just about invention. Think about the last decade. We invented the internet, and then we had this boom and bust, and everybody goes, what was that all about? So the same thing happened in semiconductors. Now, I say these are every 10 years, and I use 60, 70, 70, 80, but it's plus or minus a couple of years. We actually invented the semiconductor in 1958, Jack Kilby and Bob Noyce, but it took about a decade to get to the point that people started to have this huge belief these were going to change the world. So we had a huge boom. Dozens of semiconductor companies were funded. Every one of these cycles has the same thing. You have a big boom. Remember the last decade. By 1971, there was a bust because nobody could figure out what to do with these economically. And they weren't cheap enough. So all these things go through the first 10 years is invention, boom, and bust. But during that boom, we overfinance a bunch of stuff. And we create a lot of infrastructure that we now get to spend the next 10 years to figure out how to use. So during the 70s, what did we do? In the 70s, we first realized we had to invent manufacturing equipment so they weren't hand-assembled anymore, and we can make them by the thousands and millions. So we did that. And then we had to invent tools for people to use it. Things called CAD, CAM, in-circuit emulators, etc. So you had the basis for people to build on. And the final thing is, you can't have dozens of startups. Because if somebody's going to build a computer company on top of you, they want to know you're going to be around more than the next 24 months. So the industry consolidates. And think about this. Every 10 years, another industry consolidates. So by 1980, we were now producing these things really cheaply. We were building things on it. Now remember I said that every 10 years something started. Well, semiconductors started to get practical. So we could build things on them. The beginning of the decade, we invented the mini computer, built out of semiconductors. It was about 10 1/10 the cost of a mainframe, and now we can move computers beyond these real expensive things. We're moving the end user to a down the pyramid where more people could use it. So we took them out of the back room where only the finance department used it, and we put them on the factory floor and in the labs. And then in the middle of the decade, we invented the PC. And the end of the decade, we invented what was called the workstation, but it became the server as we know it today. So those are the building blocks of computers. Now we get to the third decade. So in the third decade, semiconductors, the third decade is commoditization. Now we make them so cheap, they're almost free. So if we remember in that decade, now chips were going down really, really fast. The canonical thing was you make all your money out of a new chip if you're in a semiconductor company in the first 6 months, then you dive the price to $1, then you dive it to 10 cents. So now you could produce anything. Oh, and by the way, we invented foundries. A foundry was a place, instead of spending $1 billion, well at that time, $500 million to build a semiconductor fabrication plant, somebody else built it for you and you just got charged for using it. So now the prices were coming down like crazy. So now that's the cycle model. Stand back and let me tell you what I said. Cycles every 10 years. You're building on top of what was invented the 10 years before. But it really takes 30 years until you get to the point that everybody can use them and they're really, really cheap. So we invented the computers model in the 70s. In the 80s, we had to invent things like software to run on them. So we got DOS and we got Windows and we got databases from Oracle. By the way, all these companies are being invented too. They're all startups. The startup is the only one that can lead the invention of the commercialization of a new invention, because it's 10 times cheaper than what was before, and the incumbents have this thing called the innovator's dilemma. If they try to jump into it, they'll kill their economics. So now we've invented the computer and we put software on it, and then we get to the 90s, and wham, they become cheap enough we can buy them, and the price goes down to $500 a piece, and they turn into laptops you can carry everywhere. Finally, we have the network. So in the 80s, we invented this thing called the hub, and the router. And the router was an inexpensive thing. It was really just a PC board with network connections on it that routed high-speed communication across the network. But they were commodities. Instead of these huge rooms of computers for doing what they called IMPs, for switching centers on the network, you get these really cheap things. They were relatively cheap. And now we can make the internet really high speed at high commodities. It took the 80s to invent those. The 90s, we had to invent a reason to use them. Well, what we ended up doing was moving all the data onto some place. Remember, you cache the data different from the servers. And then we made applications talk to one another. And that got built out. So during this decade, we made the networks really cheap. Remember my $29.95 card. That's the last 48 years. We invented the computer model. We made it really cheap. We made the whole world work. So I told you that we are now at this moment at the inflection point of history. And I think this is the most interesting inflection point ever. Or since the invention of language, anyway. This was the invention of the internet. Now, why is that so important? Well, it's so important for two reasons. First, this is what I call the final end user. Remember, I started with, in mainframes, it was only the financial guys, and then we could put the mini computer in, and we could take it to the lab on the factory floor because it was cheap enough to do there. And then we invented the PC. We put it on everybody's desktop. And then we invented the network, and we connected them all together. Well, as we're doing that, more and more and more people can use computers and can have access to a computer. That's the end point. That's the end user. Well, so now as soon as we invent the internet, everything's connected. So now, theoretically, you can reach, for no cost, just by knowing the address, any individual or anything that has an internet address anywhere in the world. And ultimately, that's everything. I'm talking in the future, of course. So that means there are no more ends. I mean, there's nothing beyond that. So that's the first issue. We've reached the final end. You can connect to anything to anything. But the value of that is buried in what I said. It's called free reach. It doesn't cost anything to reach end to end. Free reach. So what does that do? That changes the entire paradigm of computing. All computing, until that happened, was an individual sitting at a keyboard interacting with a program, just a program. We called that request response client server. You're sitting there interacting with a program. Now, you can interact with a human being as well, or any combination of human beings on demand. This changes the whole world. And you can do it synchronously or asynchronously. That means we can interact with any arbitrary set of people anywhere in the world that's on the internet in real time or in an ongoing time conversation in any kinds of groups and in any combination. This is such a fundamental change, and you'll understand when I get to the end of this, because it enables capabilities that have never happened before. So, but at the same time, we've invented this computer thing. Well, as in all technologies, at some point, we have to actually automate it and make it turn into something that's just a capacity or a utility you consume. So you've heard the term the cloud. It's really popular now, the cloud. Well, you do a lot of things in the cloud. The cloud just means that a program you're using and the data you're using is somewhere else on some other computer on the network. It's not on yours. So I like to say, Claudia, my wife, doesn't know it, but she has part of her life on the cloud because her email is an email service, happens to be AOL. So the program that's running it and her email files are in the cloud. That's somewhere else, right? She has an Apple iMac, and we use iWorld. So that means all her data's in the cloud as well. Well, the final stage, this is now cycle 4, cycle 1, remember, semiconductors, computers, and networks, cycle 1, 2, 3. Cycle 4 is the inflection point. It's the point in which, one, everything will move to the cloud. Everything. And I'll talk about why in a moment. But what that means is basically all programs and computation will exist in the cloud, and you'll consume those as services. You won't even know it. It'll be similar to the telephone system in that you may actually want to own some telephone switches yourself, but you don't want to own the telephone system. Why do you want to buy networks and lots of computers? Why do you want to be Claudia's system administrator if she can open a terminal, get on any place in the world and get on a web browser, put in her identification, and everything's there. And I never have to buy another program or never have to update it or worry about my security. The economics are overwhelming. The convenience is overwhelming, and there's a lot of reasons that's going to happen, but I'll come back to that. So there is going to be the cloud. That's the inflection point, which IT becomes a total commodity. And it has some fundamental implications on the IT industry. But that's more technical. So let's go back to the web. So if the cloud is going to become just a consumable, what's consuming it? Well, the web's consuming it. So I'm giving my own definitions of these terms, the cloud and the web. But to me, the web is the interactions and communication that is going on that is only facilitated and run by that cloud underneath. It's the conversation. Think of the telephone system. You're not thinking about all the wires and switches you're using. You're thinking about the conversation. This is the human conversation of all these groups interacting in real time in whatever is important to them with any combination of person and things that can be addressed on the network. So the web is a very interesting thing. But the web is going to take 3 cycles. Nice, it's another 3. And why? Well, because it's the evolution of technology, and it's actually the powers of the web, the internet, to create value. Now, this is an important point. Inventions of new technologies. There's an old saying, by the way. Technology drives the economy. The economy drives society. So there are very few technologies that, when invented, reach a point that they actually change the aspects of the economy. In other words, dramatically improve productivity in a free lunch sense, meaning that there's only two ways to produce more goods and services without more input, without spending more money. At the same amount of input, dollars or energy, getting more output. There's only two ways you do that. One is technology invention, and the other is specialization. So specialization is free trade and organization and all that. Technology innovation every once in a while comes around that it dramatically improves productivity. It means we can do things better, faster, and yes, cheaper than we did it before. There are three capabilities the internet brings that do this. The first, we've already talked about. It's this free reach where we can talk to everybody. So think about the first decade of the internet, 1990 to 2000. This huge boom happened, and you heard all about these companies like Amazon. Boy, I can buy these books in real time, and Amazon became a huge company. Free reach, because they didn't really have to have much of an inventory, and they could reach everybody in the world. So that became a huge network effect. They had millions of users, right? Well, because they had millions of users, they just didn't have to sell the 2,000 books that are mostly in publication today. Those millions of users, some of them want to look at books that haven't been published for a while, so they sell 2 million books. And it's a huge positive feedback because that reach is free. It doesn't cost them anything. You remember the stories about Dell killing Compaq and HP because they had this free reach to their customers. So that was the first part of free reach. And that's the first power of the internet. But it also is cycle 4. Now cycle 5, I'll tell you what the cycles are, then I'm going to go through what's going to happen for them. Cycle 5 is straight through processing. This is a little technical. But it means that if I'm Dell sitting in the middle of my internet and I want to sell you a computer, and I can see what all my customers are buying over here, and they're buying more of one kind of a computer, one kind of software than another, then I can also see my suppliers on the other side, and I can send out quotes for, give me a lower price at this and I'll buy from you rather than you. So that's straight through processing. So in real time, I can actually change my economics. And I can see that, oh, wait a minute, it's almost Christmas. Everybody wants this special kind of Imperium laptop. I don't have enough of them. I can immediately order more here and do a special on the other computers that are on both sides of that. Well, I'll drop it by 20% to lower my inventory. So if you have straight-through processing, you can actually change the economics. In other words, you can increase your throughput, lower your costs. Well, I'll come back to that, but that's a very important thing because it will create the real internet economy. And finally, there's transparency. Now, what does transparency mean? It means I can not only see end to end, but I can see everything around. And transparency has to do with data and information. If I can see data and information, all of it, going on in all sorts of realms, I can interact to things faster. I can actually be aware. I can create a consciousness or awareness of the environment. That's a really, really biggie. So cycles 4, 5, and 6. Reach, straight through processing, transparency. They are in that order because that's the stages of technology. We can do reach now. We're just starting to be able to mash up. This is a term in technology that says I can take two applications and mash them together so they can talk to one another in real time. This is sort of what all the cyber folks are doing today or beginning to do today. But being able to interpret data and be aware of things, the semantic value of what's in information that's in data that's research stuff. Okay, so we're at this inflection point. The inflection point is cycle 4. It's the invention of the internet and exploiting of free reach. Why did we have a huge bust at the beginning of this decade? Excuse me. Well, we had a bust because where's the beef? Where's the money? This didn't create any incremental new money. It just created a different channel for the money, right? And you're not creating new productivity if you're not getting more products and services through at the same costs. Well, remember, the second decade is always build out. And in 2000, almost nobody had broadband in their home. And try to do a big search with that dial-up modem with all that, people gave up in about 30 seconds, right? We didn't have the tools to go out there and look at it. We didn't have wireless on our PCs, so we could look at this. We didn't have our portables that you could get on the internet or send email. That build out happened in the first half of this decade. And we put the broadband in, and things started to really happen. So now we could put money out there. Google was the first really big application. The shopping and buying and selling on the internet went up by several sort of magnitude in the first half of this decade. Now we're talking real money out there. And we started to invent new applications like Salesforce.com, software as a service, where you didn't have to buy it a lot more. And people that weren't in big companies, now we could do the same kind of technology, IT, for medium and small size companies that the big companies can do. You just buy it by the drink. So all of a sudden, we're moving down that pyramid. More and more people are getting the conversation. The velocity of commerce is moving faster. The cost of transactions are coming down. Productivity is going up. Then we hit the killer application, because none of this was the real reach. This was still only me and a program, or me and this wasn't the real reach. The killer app that is going to be the killer app that's going to lead to the world that you will never believe is social networking. Now, it sounds kind of ho-hum. But remember, all these things start with hobbyists, and then they grow, and if they have legs, they extend out. So social networking was invented at the beginning of this decade, and it started to build out. Now, everybody's in on social networking. All that's giving us more and more stuff. We're sharing our photos and et cetera. But social networking is becoming a platform for young adults. It's becoming part of their life. It's becoming where they live. It's teaching them a number of things. One is it's teaching them to interact with others, and it's teaching them the vulnerabilities of my identity out there and what I did last night that I didn't actually want my father to see, and that's there. And so we're starting to learn kind of those things. But what we're coming to is, and the next big boom is, how are we going to monetize that? Nobody's figured out how we're going to monetize that. So there are hundreds and hundreds of venture companies now, venture-backed companies, that are in the business of monetizing this whole social networking thing. The other thing that's happened is what's called distributed co-creation of content. Boy, does that sound horrible. That's Wikipedia. That's open source. That's bloggers. That's people that can get together and communicate and co-create and evolve things in real time in a totally disorganized manner. Yes, there need to be some referees or some high priests or priestesses in some form to make sure things work forward. But all of a sudden, these are about reach. All sorts of new things are being invented. But we're going to end this decade, or this 10 years, I believe, with a bust that around, we haven't monetized this, and gosh, it's so insecure. I don't want to go I'm not going to do business where all my stuff's out there, and I don't even want to do my checking account out there anymore. It's looking really, really scary. And I'm in the middle of this security thing in Symantec, and it is much scarier than you think. But there is hope in sight. So let's talk. That's the first phase. We've now figured out how to use reach. We haven't figured out how to monetize reach, which is 1010 to 1020. But that's also the time when we get straight through processing. Now, straight through processing. So that's it. If businesses could figure out how to use that reach, and not in an advertising sense, because remember, advertising is only 3% of the global economy. You're not going to put the whole global economy on 3%. You got to actually do real commerce and creative commerce on the internet. So what has to happen? Well, first we have to be able to figure out how to make these mashups real time and not taking a lot of esoteric programmers or long developments. Now that is beginning now, and through the next decade we'll build that out. Where in real time, in a social networking environment, when I'm with my snowboard group, let's say, and I want to we're going to have a special snowboard event, we're going to have a special kind of race, and I want some design changes in my board. In the middle of our little conversation, we can invite in businesses that meet certain requirements. And they can participate in our conversation and then make bids for different things. And when we show up, there's our new fancy boards and all our stuff, and that's part of the business. That's called pull. See, this is a fundamental change. The economy over the next 30 years is going to go from push. I'm going to, as Ford said, you can have any car you want as long as it's black, right? And you go out to the showroom and you buy it. Whereas I'm going to pull into the conversation and design the product the way I want it. And if Ford can't provide it, Mitsubishi will. And that's the end of the story. So this is the pull economy. And that's another major change, because as that happens over the next 30 years, we go from a mass market to a micro market. The economy moves dramatically faster. Inventories come way down. Costs come way down. There's a whole bunch of elements. I won't go into that too much. But a bunch of other things are going to happen. The next thing that's going to happen is what I call the quadruple convergence. Today, voice, video, and computing are sort of three platforms that come together a little bit. They're all converging into one. It's all what's called TCP IP-based, network-based, with stuff running on computers and being transferred. Indistinguishable whether you're actually having an interactive game, a conversation, running a nuclear simulation, or doing the inventory for your major corporations. Just stuff you're putting out there and running on the network. So that means that the boundaries disappear in computing, but the quadruple part, the fourth part, is there will be no difference between your mobile and your on-life experience. There will be no difference. As the forms of interaction and the smartphones get smarter and smarter, you'll be one environment. Now remember, your stuff all lives on the net, so whether you're mobile or not, it's all one thing. So now as that's happening, and this social platforms you have, they're going to turn into what I call your dashboard for life. Because what happens is these things are going to start getting mashed up automatically with all the context of your life. All your contacts and friends, the situation where you are right now, the location where you are right now, your calendar, and it'll build stronger and stronger mechanisms for actually being your personal electronic assistant. Walking with you, working with you, it's always aware, it's always on, it's always in tune with what's going on in the environment. But oh boy, are we going to be in trouble. Because how are we going to secure that kind of environment? You're going to put all your money out in that kind of environment and have your whole life out there? Not only that, we can't have a bunch of code and data on our PC devices everywhere that can be attacked. They've got to be up there professionally held. And we've got to be able to identify ourselves to it. So that's the next big development, and it's moving right now. And it's actually called identity. Remember, on the social networks, everybody's learning their identity. I want to have a different identity when my father's in the conversation than when my party buddies are in the conversation. So now we have to learn to work our identity. So identity is evolving today, and it has two aspects. One is we'll be able to define the rights on who can have access to our identity and under what circumstances by what role we're in. Our student role, our role as a patient, our role as a worker, our role as a party guy, whatever, our role as a skier. And as you're in those circumstances, you'll be able to tune who has access and what kind of information is there. That's one aspect of it. The second is there's a thing called authorization and authentication. Today we call it password. Well, Passwords are pretty easy to break. So what's evolving is a new kind of identity system where your identity is under your control. That means all the information is under your control. And there will be increasingly third parties that authenticate you have those rights. Think of PayPal. Now, if you're buying something from Amazon, Amazon shouldn't, if you use PayPal, why does Amazon need to know anything about you except your address? Needs to know nothing. All it needs to know is PayPal is going to send them $29.95, and this is addressed to send the book. This is stupid. Why are we giving our identity away? We don't have to. It's a thing called zero knowledge proof. It means we can be totally anonymous in any way we want, except for legal authorities can get a subpoena and come in any such situation. And it has to evolve, and it will evolve over the next 2 years, for national security, for health care, for education, and yes, so we can live a reasonable life on the internet. And this is going on all over the place. Things are already being adopted called iCard, OpenID, et cetera, by all the big companies, and it will come together because it has to, or else there will be no life on the internet. So now we have our identity, and we have our social dashboard that we mash together. Now, as soon as we have identity in our different roles, and we can start endowing that with goals. We can say, hey, I want to shop for this kind of I'm a coin collector, and these are the coins that I want, but I only want them at these kind of prices and these kind of conditions. And then we can send that proxy out there, just hunt and be aware on the net the whole time. These are kind of interesting things. So remember, all this is developing between 2010 and 2020. Between 2020 and 2030, this whole internet commerce will change. There won't be fixed commerce, but the world will turn into predominantly pull economy, and economies will go crazy. So at this point, we actually have this proxy, this sort of proxy for life that we're dealing with. But we haven't yet talked about transparency, because this is the hardest problem of all. But it's the final really, really cool thing. All this data's out there, all this information, right? Right now, this is way out there R&D. But in the next 10 years, I contend that we're going to be able to get far enough along on it that we'll have a boom and bust in 2020. And this is where we can turn all that data into information. It's more than that. So first, we have this thing called, this technology that's been around for a long time. Tim Berners-Lee started it, called the semantic web. And now they're working on semantic web 2.0. I contend in its current incarnation, it will never work because it relies on creating what's called an ontology, which is sort of like a definition for all the terms in a language, right? But you have to create those for every circumstance in every market in every situation. And so set ontologies won't work. The other thing that won't work is databases, because we have an infinite amount of data. And it's coming in all the time. And it actually, if you're trying to, pre-store data, it means you're pre-storing in a way that predefines how easy it is to access in arbitrary ways. So that doesn't work. And it doesn't allow for what's called association of many to many. This is a many to many problem. It's called associative memory. You can think of it as the neural network problem, especially for you neuroscientists here. Those technologies are starting to be developed, where we can actually look at data, and based on the problem you're trying to solve, remember you've got this dashboard for life, we can, on the fly, create an ontology. That can pull out terms. I do believe we will get value out of the semantic web, but it'll be in pulling out of that the semantics of conversations. At that point, I'm talking 2040 now, this cyber proxy actually has an awareness of you and your environment. And not only that, your virtual and your physical lives have merged. The conversations you're doing and the people you're interacting with won't necessarily be in the same room or even at the same time. This is what I call the cyber proxy and the world of web presence. So I'm going to just give you some characteristics of that world. First, I'll call this my cyber proxy. In web presence, got this awareness. This thing has learned to more and more about me, my strengths, my weaknesses. My cyber proxy is my buddy, my mentor, and my guardian under my control, or of those who are authorized to control or be my overseers or my helpers. It's always there. It's always aware of my situation, my needs, my desires, my limitations, and it adaptively enhances my abilities while mitigating the limitations of my disabilities. I'm never alone or lost unless I want to be. My identities are under my control, and my communities, including my support structure, are always available to reach out to me, or to be reached out to by my proxy if the need arises. The world conforms to me and my abilities. By this time, everything's connected. It's called the network of things. So if it's aware of me and I'm waking up, that room is going to conform to what I need when I wake up. And by the way, remember, what implication is this going to have on the human brain and on learning and moving forward? Because every piece of information is available. Think of Google multiplied, always available, and with your awareness, it can actually help distill the things you need at that moment. This is going to be a total change on how we train the human brain. Now, one other point of this theory. 30 years is a cycle. I participated in a panel for the Chief Technology Officer of DoD in 2004 to try to determine why we were dramatically better at using technology between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. The conclusion was the generals in the second Gulf War grew up with computers. I believe there is something to the way we form the synapses of the brain between, we know this, between about 3 and 9 and then on through 20, that is going to totally change with this whole thing. It starts with social networking. People are going to live in a world in which they're multitasking all the time, continually, and they're going to have to learn how to work with around the things that are distractions and focused on the contexts of what it is they're trying to achieve. Learn concepts, models, and building blocks. So this is going to change the brain. It's going to change how we work and live together. So why is this going to happen? Technology shapes the economy, and the economy changes society. And the three powers of the network to create value are unprecedented in all of human history to date in their powers to shape the economy. Caveat: moral, cultural, and political implications. These will be the things that will dictate how even and how fast these changes actually happen. But because technology shapes the economy and the economy shapes society, this is inevitable. It's only a matter of time unless civilization either undergoes a global conflagration or an environmental catastrophe. And so, caveat emptor, that's the vision of the future of our cyber world, according to Bill Coleman. Take from it what you think is correct. And I think we have a few minutes if anybody has questions, but I'm sure I was so clear there isn't a question in the gallery.